All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to your third to last human anatomy lecture for the semester. We are going to pick up where we left off on Monday today, talking about the endocrine system, probably wrapping that up. And if we have time, starting in on our last body system we'll cover this semester, which is the respiratory system, which will tie into what you covered in lab today. So you can see an example on the title slide here. So these are two guys that have been very differently affected by growth hormone. In one case, we have pituitary dwarfism. At the time this photo was taken, if I'm not mistaken, these were the tallest and the shortest people in the world. And then we have an example of gigantism as a result of overproduction of human growth hormone. So it's pretty amazing to see that comparison and that size difference. With that in mind, today's agenda looks like this. We're going to start off with the drawing activity because I keep getting feedback from all of you that you love drawing and you just can't get enough of it. So I just want to honor that request from everyone. You're probably looking around wondering who your classmates are that are sending me those messages. I'll keep you guessing. We're going to finish up the endocrine system, start in the respiratory system, and then I've got a bunch of reminders and schedule details and take it out for you today too. So let's hop into it with a drawing. Basically the same format as last class, only now I'd like you to label the major structures of the major endocrine organs. I left a couple here for you just to make sure, because some of these arrows are a little tricky to see where it points. But the other ones, you go ahead and draw this and fill it in. Also, I want to emphasize that I do want you to draw this diagram. I mean, obviously, you don't have to draw a perfect human form here, but do draw it out and draw the general location of these structures. That is going to help you memorize it. A few of you from your ticket out on Monday got partial credit because you didn't give me a drawing, you just listed things. But the whole point of this is that you're using that muscle memory to draw out where those structures are in the body to help you remember. All right, this is just meant to be a review for you, kind of get you thinking about these organs and give you a little assessment of what you're remembering and not. So your diagram should look something like this. So remember, we have the pineal gland, which remember is part of the epithalamus. So it's just there on like the posterior part of the diencephalon. And we have your hypothalamus and your pituitary. We talked about those in detail. Hypothalamus, of course, being another part of your diencephalon, the pituitary being this two-part gland that we're going to talk about in some detail today, that just kind of hangs down from the hypothalamus and sits in the sella turcica of your sphenoid bone. Moving down, we have your thyroid and your parathyroid glands. We'll talk about those today. Your thymus, you remember from our discussion of the immune system. And here we have your kidneys, and notice we have your pancreas and your adrenal glands here. You all saw pancreas yesterday in our cat dissection. And a cat, remember, it was kind of thin and diffuse tissue. It wasn't really as well defined as it is in a human, but it was kind of between the stomach and the spleen, we call that. And then finally, we have our gonads, ovaries in females and testes in males. So let's continue our walkthrough of these organs and talk a little bit more about their structure and their function. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask real quick. I can't remember, why are some labeled blue and some labeled red?
Good question. Thanks for asking that. So the ones in red are exclusively endocrine organs, whereas the ones in blue also serve other, they have other functions as well. So like the hypothalamus is an endocrine gland, but also part of the brain, part of the nervous system, etc. Yeah, thanks for asking that. And like the testes, for example, are involved with sperm production, but also testosterone production. Cool. All right, so going back to our outline, we talked a little bit about the pituitary and the hypothalamus yesterday, or excuse me, Monday. Today, I want to move and talk about the pineal gland. So this is a diagram of the brain. You're familiar with this. I'm not going to get into detail. So we covered this already. We talked about the brain and you saw it in lab. Just want to remind you that the pineal gland is this little guy right here. So here's your diencephalon. There's your hypothalamus on the anterior of the diencephalon. And then you've got your infundibulum. And then you've got your pituitary. Is not labeled here, but it's going to be right around in here. I was going to say something else about that for now. I'll just leave it there. So your pineal gland is there. And what the pineal gland does, it is this little, it's kind of like pine cone shaped. It's on the roof of the diencephalon, again, part of the epithalamus. And it contains what's called pinealocytes that are I can't pronounce that word. Pinealocytes that are arranged in clusters that give it this pine cone shape. Don't worry about that. I'm just kind of describing it to you. I'm not going to ask you to like regurgitate this kind of description of it. What I do want you to know is where it's located and then that it's responsible for secreting the hormone melatonin. You've probably heard of melatonin. It plays an important role in regulating your awake sleep cycle and your circadian rhythms. And it helps to kind of regulate when you're active and alert versus when you get sleepy and when you sleep. And it plays a role in actually suppressing the gonads. So it interacts with the hormones that stimulate, for example, sexual arousal in a way that's kind of unexpected. Actually, the way this hormone works is actually it reduces your sexual arousal, usually later in the evening and into the night when it's time to sleep. So we've all been having sex at the wrong time of day. Sorry, guys. Then the other important thing here is that what's called pineal sand. So part of this organ contains these calcium particles that show up really, really well in an X-ray. And I actually took the slide out that has the X-ray to show you. Let me just see if I have that right here. So I want to show that to you. Nope, I don't have it handy. Okay. Well, you have to take my word for it. They show up really well in X-rays. And so the pineal gland is often used as a kind of landmark in X-rays. If you see an X-ray of a brain, you can pick out that pineal gland really well because it has these calcium particles, and then you can figure out what the other structures are based on that. So the takeaway here, I want you to know where this is. And then I want you to know that it releases melatonin, which is important for the sleep cycle. So for each of these organs, I'm going to put up a big yellow and green thing on here that's like, this is the function you should associate with this organ. We're not going to get into tons of detail about that in this class. That's more for your physiology class. But I do want you to know, okay, the pineal gland produces melatonin. That's important for your sleep cycle and your circadian rhythm. And I'll do that for all of the glands here. It's kind of a little summary. And that's all we're saying about the pineal gland. Questions? All right. So I want to talk about a couple glands that are derived from the pharyngeal pouch. So don't worry about that. That gets into developmental stuff that we haven't really covered. But basically, I want to talk about 3 glands that are in the neck and upper thoracic cavity. And that is the thyroid, the parathyroid, and the thymus. So here is a dissection of a cadaver. You're looking anteriorly at the neck here. You can see some of the structures that we looked at in the cat here. For example, you've got your superior vena cava over here, your aorta. You can kind of orient yourself. What I want to draw your attention to right now, though, is this kind of butter-shaped gland that's right here. You can't see it very well in the cadaver because the color is matched. I'll show you a diagram in a second. But we have the right lobe, the left lobe of the thyroid gland, and we have what's called the isthmus of the thyroid gland that's just anterior to the trachea. So the thyroid gland sits kind of just underneath this cartilage that you feel here. So it's like right in there. It's a little butterfly shaped guy. and it's right just anterior to your trachea. And if we look at this from a posterior view, so I'm flipping this around now, we're looking at the back of the head. You can see the pharynx. We'll talk about this in a little more detail later this week, but you might recall that from lab yesterday when you looked at those sagittally cut cat heads. This is looking at from the back, and notice the thyroid gland doesn't wrap all the way around posteriorly, but we have these 4 little glands that are embedded in the thyroid gland, and those are called your parathyroid glands. I want to emphasize that even though thyroid and parathyroid share a similar name, the parathyroid are embedded in the thyroid gland. There are 2 very different structures, and they release 2 different hormones, in fact, that have opposite effects. So the thyroid generally is associated with metabolism and your metabolic rate. So I gave the example of Graves' disease when there's a thyroid disorder that basically ramps up its production of thyroid hormones and increases your metabolic rate, causes you to be very energetic. You get very hot when the room temperature is suitable. You can get bulging eyeballs are one of the symptoms of that as well. They talk about this a little bit in one of the crash course A&P videos that I signed for this week as well. So the thyroid gland, generally, I just want you to know it's associated with your body's metabolism. It also releases a hormone that regulates calcium. But I won't talk about that too much, but the takeaway message is that it regulates metabolism and calcium. The parathyroid gland regulates calcium, and they have opposing effects. So the thyroid gland promotes calcium uptake, and the parathyroid gland promotes the release of calcium. And so we can see this here. Thyroid gland, I want you to know it's responsible for metabolism, a little bit of calcium, and the parathyroid for regulating calcium levels. Calcium levels are super important in your body because, for example, your muscles won't function properly without it. So if you have a lack of calcium in your skeletal muscle, you can get spasms or lack of functionality of those muscles. So regulating calcium in the body is super important.
You said thyroid releases calcium, right?
Thyroid, what's and parathyroid is uptake. Oh shoot, did I hold that? I'm getting my mental signals reversed here, and I want to just double check. Did I say that? Let me just double check that, because now I'm thinking I'm second guessing myself if I got that reversed. I just want to settle this squarely while we're right here. I apologize. Respiratory system. Suspense is building. Okay, so let me make sure we've got this. So here, the thyroid primarily it's primarily responsible for releasing thyroid hormones that regulate your metabolism, but it also releases calcitonin, which decreases calcium, circulating calcium. So it promotes your kidneys to absorb calcium from the bloodstream and excrete it. And then the parathyroid releases, which is called parathyroid hormone. and that is going to increase levels of circulating calcium. And it does that, for example, by increasing the activity of the osteoclasts in the bone. So remember, osteoclasts are those cells in the bone that degrade bone and remove bone. They basically like eat away the bone. And when they do that, they release the calcium that's part of that calcium matrix of the bone. So the parathyroid hormone will increase the activity of the osteoclasts to increase circulating calcium. Thanks for asking that. I'm glad I got this straight.
So thyroid is uptake and parathyroid is release.
Thyroid will decrease the levels of your circulating calcium, and by limiting osteoclast function and also telling your kidneys to absorb more calcium from the bloodstream and get rid of it, get it out, your parathyroid will increase circulating.
Okay, so it's decreasing it by not uptaking it, but instead of moving it from the body.
It's going to remove calcium from the body. Yeah, yeah. Or keep it locked up in your bones, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan.
So if you had like, say, you had a problem with your parathyroid,
Mhm.
the parathyroid hormone not show up like enough in your blood or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then that would screw up your calcium balance, basically.
Could that like result in something like osteoporosis?
Well, I guess it could if you're increasing the activity of those osteoclasts. Yeah, that could happen. You would have to do an increase of parathyroid hormone, but. Cool. All right. Sorry about that. Parathyroid, thyroid. That's all I'm saying. You good? Forget those guys. Let's talk about the thymus. So the thymus is this immune organ that's located kind of right here, just kind of anterior and a little bit superficial to the heart. Remember, for some of our cats, we had to move the thymus out of the way to get to the heart. So it's in the mediastinum, which is that cavity that's between your lungs and your thoracic cavity. This guy, as you recall, is where T lymphocytes are made from precursor cells. So remember, your lymphocytes, they all originate in the red bone marrow. Some of them circulate to the thyroid where they become these T lymphocytes. And this activity is regulated by two thymic hormones. That's thymopoietin and thymosin. I'm not going to get into the details of this pathway at all. Again, this is an anatomy class, so I want you to know where the thymus is, what it looks like, and generally what it does. And we talked about one of its roles in the immune system already. And here I just want you to know that that functionality is regulated by these hormones that it secretes, specifically thymopoietin and thymosin. So thymus gland makes immune cells. And then I've got just a couple more for you here. We've got other endocrine glands that include your adrenal glands, your pancreas, and your gonads. So let's walk through these. And then we have a few other final organs that that produce hormones, although their primary function is not that of an endocrine organ. But first, the adrenal glands. So these guys are probably the endocrine organ you're most likely to have heard of because they are responsible for producing a number of hormones, one of which, or a couple of which I should say, include adrenaline, right? And so these guys, the adrenal glands, receive signals that are sent out by the anterior pituitary that regulate the production of some hormones, but they also are directly innervated by the nervous system in the medulla here and they produce, this is where the adrenaline is produced. So the adrenal glands, I want to emphasize, they're basically two glands in one. You have an outer cortex that's primarily responsible for producing glucocorticoids, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then you have this medulla that's responsible for producing adrenaline. So specifically, that's epinephrine and norepinephrine. The cortex receives messages from the anterior pituitary, and that stimulates the production of these glucocorticoids. Whereas the medulla basically is it's essentially a ganglia associated with the peripheral nervous system, or part of the peripheral nervous system, and it produces this norepinephrine and epinephrine when it's stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, the stress response nervous system, which makes sense because those are hormones that are responsible for your immediate, the famous kind of flight or fight response, right? When you're in danger, within like a fraction of a second, you can feel that jolt of energy. Like if you're driving a car and all of a sudden something comes out in front of you, like within a fraction of a second, you all of a sudden your alertness is raised, your skeletal muscles have tons of energy, like you're ready to go in that fraction of a second. And that's thanks to the adrenaline produced in this medulla. So let me back up for a second. And I got excited. I like the adrenal. The adrenal glands are kind of my favorite. I'm not going to lie. Of all the glands, no offense to the thymus, but adrenal's where it's at. These guys I often refer to them as little kidney hats. They're these pyramidal shaped structures that are superior to each of the kidneys. So they're paired. You have two adrenal glands, and they have a lot of blood supply because they're both receiving hormonal signals and they're producing hormones. And so they need a lot of associated blood vessels to make that happen. And they have, as I said, the medulla is innervated by these sympathetic fibers. And so they essentially are signaled directly from the nervous system to release adrenaline. And that helps with the rapidity of that response. That's why that response can happen in less than seconds sometimes. So let's walk through it in a little more detail. I want to talk about the outer part, the adrenal cortex. I mentioned the adrenal glands, essentially two glands in one. So let me back up here. You've got the cortex on the outside. So remember, cortex always means on the outside. So think of your cerebral cortex, that outer layer of gray matter around the brain is on the outside. And then you've got the medulla on the inside. You see something similar when we talked about the spleen, for example, has a cortex and a medulla. The brain has a cortex, the cerebral cortex. And of course, the inside, we see the term medulla as well, although it's not quite inside and outside as clearly as it is here in the brain. I want to talk about the outside first. And this part of the adrenal gland produces a variety of steroid hormones. Now, steroid hormones are notable because they are lipid soluble. And so this is important. I don't think I have this on the slide. They are lipid soluble, which means they're hydrophobic. And why is it important that they're lipid soluble or hydrophobic? Why does that matter for the structure of those hormones? Yeah.
They can pass right through the lipid bilayer.
Exactly. So you've got, remember, around each cell, you have this lipid bilayer. If you're lipid soluble and you're small enough, you can just zip right through there. And that's exactly what these steroid hormones do. And I want to talk about just a couple of them. One family of these is called glucocorticoids. They serve to regulate your energy balance and the amount of blood sugar. Blood sugar is super important because that is the primary energy substrate for cells throughout your body, is that glucose. They also produce mineral corticoids, which regulate the salt level in your blood. And they also produce a hormone called DHEA. It's got a really long name. Don't worry about it. We'll just call it DHEA. This is the precursor to both estrogen and testosterone. So you see this endocrine organ is producing hormones that regulate your energy availability, regulate your sodium content in your blood, and then also regulate these sex hormones that we'll talk about in more detail when we get to the ovaries and testes. So lots of stuff going on here in the adrenal medulla, or excuse me, the adrenal cortex. Yep, Dan. Oh, it stands for oh gosh, I should know this off the top of my head. I don't remember, to be honest. I forget. It's in your book. Oh, I knew it the other day. Oh, that's right. All right, the adrenal medulla, the inner part, is part of the sympathetic nervous system, as I mentioned, and it contains these clusters of neurons that release your catecholamine. So I've been using the word adrenaline. Adrenaline and catecholamine are synonymous, but specifically we want to talk about the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these guys have slightly different functional roles in that immediate stress response. But we're not going to worry about that here. I just want you to know it produces these two hormones. Now, what's important to note is that all of this is important for the stress response generally, but it's these catecholamines, this adrenaline, that's responsible for that immediate fight or flight stress response. And when I say fight or flight, I mean you're getting attacked by a bear. You need to decide if you're going to fight that bear or you're going to run away from that bear, like that immediate stress response within seconds or minutes. Hormones here, especially the hormone corticosterone or cortisol in humans, it's corticosterone in snakes and lizards. So I'm always thinking more about the physiology of snakes and lizards than humans. But in cortisol, it is the primary glucocorticoid in humans, and it's responsible for a number of things, but that includes this kind of long-term stress response. You could think of it more as like recovering from stress. So you're out in the woods for a walk, you're enjoying yourself, you get attacked by a bear, catecholamines kick in within seconds, you decide you're going to fight that bear. Of course, you fight the bear because that's what you do. Boom, bear gets knocked down, he runs away. Then minutes later, you're like, damn, that was stressful. And then you got to recover from that stress. And that's where the glucocorticoids come in. They help you kind of regain your blood sugar levels and kind of get back to homeostatic levels. So they work together, both part of the stress response, but it's that immediate response that's the catecholamines. Meanwhile, the bear is having the exact same thing happen because bears are mammals and they have, these pathways are actually highly conserved across all vertebrates. They're a little different, but the same idea is there. And so the bear just had the same thing. His adrenaline went up when he saw you, although it might have been a little different because he was hungry and not scared. But then he realized that you're super scary, and then that catecholamines kicked in. Now he's in his cave recovering. They don't really live in caves, just for the record. Go ahead, Sarah.
So both are like part of the sympathetic nervous system.
Say one more time.
Both of these are part of the sympathetic nervous system.
Well, it's a little complicated, but no. The adrenal medulla is innervated directly by I would say this is part of the sympathetic nervous system because it's these ganglia here that are producing these hormones. The adrenal cortex is regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, but indirect. It's regulated via hormones from the anterior pituitary. And actually, let me show you that. So I've got this nice diagram here. So remember, we've got our hypothalamus and our anterior pituitary here. On the left side, you see this short-term stress response regulated, or that's not regulated, but the response driven by the adrenal medulla. And you can see that nerves originating at the hypothalamus travel down through the spinal cord, and then those nerves are directly part of this adrenal medulla, and that's where you have this short-term stress response. And so that includes an increase in blood pressure, so you can be ready to go, like physically. Your bronchioles dilate in your lungs, so you can get oxygen quicker. You're going to increase the amount of available glucose to your skeletal muscles. And then unimportant things shut down. So for example, the blood flow from your digestive system is reduced, your reproductive system, your urinary system, because in that moment when you're fighting the bear, it doesn't matter that you're digesting lunch or not, right? Because if you don't beat the bear, then the lunch isn't really going to matter. And it overall serves to increase your metabolic rate. On the other side, we have like a longer stress response, and that is regulated here by the hypothalamus, but now sending messages to the anterior pituitary, which releases this other hormone called ACTH, which finds its way to the adrenal cortex. And then we have this long-term stress response regulated by these glucocorticoids and somewhat by the mineralocorticoids. And specifically, we're going to keep breaking down proteins or fats to produce more glucose to recover from the stressor. The immune system is suppressed, which is why, my friends, after exam period, you get a cold, right? How many of you have done that? Like you plow through a semester, you're finally done, your last week's really stressful, you're finally done, and then you get sick, right? That's because you're experiencing, well, partially anyway, this long-term stressor of like trying to finish up the semester, blah, blah, blah. And then you're kind of at this low level stress that's constantly activating these glucocorticoids. And one of the outcomes of those glucocorticoids is suppression of your immune system. And so you finally make it through and your immune system is kind of crappy because you've been focused on other things like surviving. And yeah, go ahead, Dan.
That's also stress associated with some stress ulcers.
But that's a little bit different. I mean, because that's part of your digestive system. It can be associated, yeah. I mean, that's just this long-term kind of chronic stress. And the stress response, I want to emphasize, is really good. Like that's part of our natural physiology that helps keep us alive. If we didn't have a stress response, we'd be screwed because anything important that happened in our life, we'd just be like, yeah, whatever, right? And thinking about an evolutionary history, you kind of need to feel like some things are important, like you're running out of food or being chased by a bear. Like stress is good. But stress can also be bad if it's prolonged, right? If every single day you're waking up and you're stressed out, you're like, man, I got human anatomy again, and I just haven't memorized all of these pathways, and that happens chronically, then that can lead to problems or whatever any variety of modern stressors. We generally live our lives pretty stressed out in the modern world. It kind of sucks. It's not good for our physiology. It leads to high blood pressure and another number of other chronic ailments. So Just chill out, guys. Chill out. Cool. Questions? Boom. I do want you to know the adrenal glands are composed of the cortex and the medulla. Know that the cortex is regulated by hormones from the anterior pituitary. Know that the medulla is part of the sympathetic nervous system, and know the kind of functional roles of those hormones. We're not going to, there's whole, I mean, we could spend a whole semester talking about these hormones. And these guys, I said I like them a lot because I actually have studied glucocorticoids in snakes and lizards pretty extensively. So I like talking about like stress response in snakes. It's cool. Not response to snakes, in snakes. Poor little guys do get stressed out. Yeah, totally. Yep. I'm hedging here, but I believe all vertebrates have the adrenal glands. These endocrine pathways are super, to go back super deep in evolutionary time. All right, let's talk about a couple more here, just in great overview. The pancreas. You remember the pancreas again from your cats. It serves as both endocrine and exocrine functions. So remember, exocrine is when refers to when these glands are producing molecules that are released through a duct. In this case, the pancreas produces some enzymes that are important for digestion and dumps them into your small intestine, the duodenum of the small intestine. Kind of working with your gallbladder is associated with that too. We're not going to get into that in too much detail here, but I want you to know that it serves, produces these enzymes that are important for digestion, but also serves as an endocrine gland. And specifically, it is important in regulating glucose and produces a hormone that you've all heard of called insulin. So there's there's more than this, but I'm going to talk about, there's, how do I want to approach this? All right, what I want you to focus on, you don't worry about the details of the microscope slide. The important thing here is that we have these two kinds of cells, alpha and beta. One of them produces glucagon, one of them produces insulin. And both of these cells regulate the circulating glucose in your blood. So diabetes, let's talk about type 1 diabetes. So this is a diabetes that originates when you're usually pretty young and is due to what happens is your immune cells. I've talked a lot in the class about how your immune cells can do the wrong thing often. They actually attack these beta cells in your pancreas and destroy them. And so you can't produce insulin. And what happens is insulin, when it's released, promotes the uptake of glucose from your bloodstream into your organs. And so if you can't produce insulin, what happens is your organs don't get enough glucose, so they don't have energy. So specifically things like your eyes can get damaged. Your brain needs glucose. You can get foggy headed, you can get delirious. But then you also have a ton of glucose circulating in your blood, which actually in itself can be toxic. And that's why folks that have diabetes are constantly monitoring their glucose levels, because these cells that are supposed to produce this insulin to do that for them aren't working for whatever reason. You can also get what's called type 2, what used to be called adult onset diabetes, but is now called type 2 diabetes because so many kids are getting it. And that is not due to the lack of production of insulin, but it's when your cells in your body don't respond to that insulin in the way that they should. And that basically is due to sedentary lifestyle, poor diet, and lack of exercise. I guess sedentary lifestyle and poor exercise are the same thing. So it's associated often with obesity. It's associated with folks that aren't just getting nutritionally or exercise-wise what their body needs. And so the same thing basically happens. Your poor beta cells are cranking out the insulin being like, hey, tissues, take up this glucose. Come on now, it's really high. And those tissues are like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And that obviously creates a ton of health issues as well. On the counter side, I'll get you 1 second, Sarah. These glucagon, the alpha cells, glucagon does the opposite, right? Glucagon and insulin are antagonists. Glucagon tries to increase the amount of circulating glucose in your blood and tells those peripheral cells, your skeletal muscle, things like that, like don't take up any more glucose. You've got enough. We need to keep this in the circulation. Go ahead, Sarah.
So does type 1 diabetes is associated with adults, not children?
Type 1 actually is congenital. And so that means that it's like really nothing you can do to prevent it. And it usually manifests when kids are really young. Often it can be very, very young, like toddlers, and it can lead to like, what's that?
Can it develop to be type 2, or is it just like?
They're two pretty different. I mean, I suppose if you had type 1 diabetes and you lived a really unhealthy lifestyle, you could probably get some conflation of the two, but they're very different. They have very different causes. One, type 1 diabetes is because these beta cells are destroyed and you're not producing insulin. Type 2 is because all of the cells in other places in your body don't respond to insulin. So it's called like insulin insensitivity, or there's a more specific term I can't think of. Basically, they're just not responding to that insulin.
My like mom has type 2 diabetes, but like I'm so confused on why she has to like keep like medicine in the fridge. And, like, it's, like,
Does she take insulin, or
I
she
don't-
did? Yeah, it depends what it is. Yeah.
I don't know if it's like exactly insulin. 'Cause I know she like doesn't like monitor her glucose levels,
Mhm.
but like, it's like her blood, like she monitors that. Like she takes like a needle.
Yeah, you get a little glucometer and you got to measure your blood glucose. We actually use those exact same things in snakes. It's super fun. I don't know the medicine. It just depends. I mean, a lot of medicines just need to be cold to be stable, and they'll just degrade if they're at room temp or something like that. So, but there's lots of different medications to treat like different aspects of this. Yeah.
Is there some relation between type 1 diabetes, like in kids, and the kidneys? So like you need to pee a lot?
That's a different kind of diabetes. So the diabetes I've been talking about is technically diabetes mellitus. The diabetes you're thinking of is diabetes insipidus, and that's actually due to a pathology in a different hormonal pathway, both called diabetes. One increases your blood sugar, bless you, and the other makes you pee a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. Which can be really dangerous because you're basically constantly, water is just constantly flushing out of you. So you got to constantly stay hydrated. Go ahead, Dan.
So, in terms of the alpha and beta cells,
Mhm.
what's the, like you were saying about type 2 and type 1 diabetes, how they call alpha and beta cells. What's that?
Well, type 1 diabetes is caused by the destruction of these beta cells. And what happens, for reasons I don't think we fully understand, is the immune cells go in and they're like, I'm going to get you type 2 or excuse me, beta type cells in the pancreas, and they destroy them. And then your rest of your body's like, you a-holes, you just destroyed our insulin producing cells. And now we have to deal with wild fluctuations in our glucose levels. I'm anthropomorphizing there a little bit, but if I was other cells in the body, and those immune cells went in and destroyed those beta cells, I'd be unhappy.
Type 2 is a lack of response to the.
Yeah, you're still producing insulin, but the cells just aren't responding to it the way they should.
Lack of response in the beta cells.
Well, the beta cells are still doing their job. They're producing insulin, but cells throughout the body are just not responding to that insulin the way they should. Cool. All right, I'm going to do, we got just enough time. Let's wrap up the endocrine system here with our sex hormones. So generally, these are referred to as the gonads, specifically the testes and ovaries. This is where your sex hormones are produced primarily. If you're gonadally male, then specialized cells called interstitial cells in your testes secrete your androgens, which is your sex hormones, and primarily that's going to be testosterone. If you're gonadally female, then your follicle cells in your ovaries are producing estrogen and progesterone. I'm not going to get into the super detailed stuff we could talk about with sex hormones and all this fun stuff. I just want you to know, generally, these are endocrine organs. Testes produce testosterone primarily, also some estrogen. And these follicle cells primarily, again, but not exclusively, are producing estrogen and progesterone. And progesterone is important for specifically for developing embryos and maintenance of the uterus during embryonic development. Boom, that's all we got to do. That was gonads in 45 seconds. A couple other endocrine structures that I promised you is that we also have these specialized endocrine cells that occur within some other organs. I'm just going to walk through these very quickly. You don't need to know details. One is the heart. Surprisingly, the heart is actually functions as an endocrine organ because your atria produce their specialized cells that produce what's called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. The GI tract, so that is your small and large intestines, have these enteroendocrine cells that produce hormones responsible for like regulating appetite and things like that. The placenta sustains the fetus and secretes lots of steroid hormones that help regulate the way that nutrition is allocated between the mom and the fetus, and basically also helps maintain the fetus and helps the mom not think the fetus is an invading organism that should be destroyed. So the placenta is a super important endocrine organ as well. Again, I'm just giving you the general overview here. I want you to know the structures and that they do act as endocrine organs. A couple more here. We also have the kidneys. So the adrenal glands, of course, sit atop the kidneys, but there's also the kidneys themselves that secrete renin. And then other cells in the kidney secrete erythropoietin. So erythropoietin is actually important for regulating red blood cell production. Renin is important for regulating electrolyte concentration in your blood and your urine. And then finally, the skin produces hormones as well. And specifically, there's these specific molecules that are converted to a precursor for vitamin D. So we often hear about why getting a certain amount of sunshine is good for your body, right? And that's because what happens here is due to this hormones that's produced in your skin, it converts cholesterol to vitamin D, which then in turn helps your body uptake calcium from your diet and bring calcium in. So and this is initiated by exposure to UV light, which is important. Mm-hmm.
I was gonna ask that about the
Yep. That's why you need to get a certain amount of UV light, and you can be vitamin D deficient without it. You can get vitamin D from your diet too. That's why I put vitamin D in a lot of milk, because back in the day, so all of this goes through calcium, and if you don't get enough calcium, your bones don't develop properly. If your bones don't develop properly, you get weak or malformed bones. For example, rickets. So back in the day when people lived in cities and like didn't ever see the sun and life was miserable. I mean, like, you know, let's talk about the turn of the century and late 1800s. There's lots of rickets because their diet sucked and they didn't get any sunlight. And so they solved this partially by adding vitamin D to milk so that kids would get enough vitamin D so that they could in turn absorb calcium and their bones would develop properly. Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, if you were never like having vitamin D in your diet, did you get by without consuming it, or is the skin just a supplementation of natural vitamin D?
Well, you need to get it somewhere, and you get it either through this process, UV exposure, or you get it through your diet. So you could.
You don't need to eat it.
You wouldn't need to have much of it in your diet if you're getting a lot of natural UV light. And it's a remarkable how little UV exposure you need to get enough vitamin D. Like, it's not a lot of sunlight. We're all live in Ohio. We don't have rickets, right? But you do need to have some for sure. Mm-hmm. All right, that's all I want to talk about with endocrine system. I'm going to not do the respiratory system today. So let me go through this real fast. I'll save this for Friday. And instead, I'm going to make up a couple announcements here. Remember, Princeton's talk is tomorrow. Be there. It's going to be great. Also, note that the biology board nominations are due today. If you or someone you know isn't graduating and is interested in taking part in this, I'm happy to answer questions about it. Although you can contact the two co-chairs currently. That's Nebraska White and Chase Reinert. This is a big announcement. I made this slide special. Ready? Boom. Do your course evaluations. They're open now and they're due on Tuesday next week. For this class and all of them, I want to just say that I read those carefully, and it provides super important feedback for me for improving the class in the future. And it's actually important for me to I like getting them. It's helpful for me, but also like those evaluations are super important when I'm up for like tenure and promotion. And they're like, did you do a good job in your classes? And I can be like, yeah, look at this human anatomy class. So please, for this and all your classes, complete them thoroughly and honestly. Like, the feedback is really valuable. Please don't blow them off. And with that in mind, we'll make sure we have time on Tuesday. If you want to just take time during our lab time on Tuesday to fill them out, that's fine too. But make sure you do them. Otherwise, a reminder, we've got lecture on Friday and then again Monday. You've seen this before. Just want to put it up again. It's in your class program. Remember that quiz number 6 is going to be during lab time next week, Tuesday. It will cover your lymphatic, immune, and endocrine systems. It will be closed book. But I'm not going to give you long answer questions like I did with the last quiz. I'm going to save that for your open book exam. Instead, you can expect multiple choice and fill in the blank. So it's closed book, but I'm not going to ask you for long answers. And that's next Tuesday. In your class program for Friday, I also put times for your lab practical. I'm going to split the class in half. Half of you are going to start at 1:30, half of you are going to start at 3 o'clock on Friday the 29th, right? And I put that list in the class program that's available right now. Final reminder, Chase is holding tutoring sessions, although I guess that was last night. And then here's your ticket out for today. Let me know what questions you have as we work through this. I will stop recording here.